Hey everyone, it's Mr. McLaughlin again, and today we're going to start actually making something in Unity that's a little more interesting than a cube. This is actually one of my favorite parts of any new project, is creating the terrain. So you're going to learn how to make a terrain, how to edit it, give it hills and valleys, textures, and paint on it. And it's really fun how powerful Unity is. Like you can make something that looks really cool, really fast, and it's going to be fun to learn. So let's take a look. Alright, so if you're jumping back into the same scene that we started in last time, you've still probably got a cube there. I'm going to go and actually just get that out of my way first, so I'm going to go over to the cube in my hierarchy, and I am going to control click it so that I can pull up a little drop down and just tell it to delete that. Next, we're going to actually create our terrain, which is very similar to how we created our cube. We go Game Object, 3D Object, and instead of Cube, we go down to Terrain and click on that. Easy enough. Now, I actually don't see it right away, though it is here. I'm going to go over to it in the hierarchy and double-click on it, like we learned last time. That'll help us find it really easily. And as we take a look at our terrain right now, it's incredibly boring. It is just a flat plane. It is just a flat square, and it's completely white. So let's start making this look a little more interesting. Oh, and one thing to note, if you wanted to make this bigger, there is a way, but don't try to use the scale tool to resize it. It's the one game object that just can't be resized the way that other game objects can. Terrain is also a unique game object in that it has a lot of unique ways that we can interact with it. And to get access to those, we need to make sure that we actually select our terrain. So I'm just going to go to my selection tool and I'm going to click on the terrain, and over on the right hand side you'll see a whole bunch of new tools pop up in our inspector. Now the first one on the left is the raise or lower terrain tool. There's a bunch of different brushes that we can use with this, and when we click on the tool it gives us a few pointers down below saying that you can click to raise the terrain or shift click to lower the terrain. So right now I'm clicking and I am raising up the terrain, though it's going pretty slowly. You can start to see it actually happen here. Now there's some settings that we can change aside from picking what type of brush we use. There's also the brush size and opacity tools. If you turn up the opacity, it will help you make bigger changes more quickly. Now I don't necessarily recommend cranking this up all the time. It can be useful sometimes and it can be good to learn and just sort of see how the tool works. But if you're trying to make a more realistic environment with like subtle hills, making these gigantic mounds can not be necessarily all that helpful. But it's good to actually see how it works. And again, there's a bunch of different types of brushes that you can paint different shapes. I like some of these ones down here where you can kind of really easily paint like rough terrain that looks like it's very hilly or rocky. So experiment with some of your brushes, play around with the sizes and the sliders, and just get a feel for how raising this terrain works. Remember, if you want to lower something back down, you can hold down Shift and you can lower it back down. But you can't make anything go lower than the starting height of the terrain. So if you raised up a hill, you can lower it back down, or you can make a mountain range and then lower a valley in between it, but you can't just take the starting height and make it any lower than it already is. Alright, now we're going to look at another unique terrain tool. To the right of the Raise Lower tool is the Paint Height tool, and this one doesn't explain itself quite as easily just by the name, so let me explain what it does. If you hold down Shift and click on any location on your terrain, the brush is basically going to memorize that height. So I clicked about halfway up one of these mountains here, or I should say I shift clicked about halfway up a mountain, and then when I let go of Shift and start painting, it's going to raise any lower terrain up to that height, and it is going to lower any higher terrain down to that height. So here I shift click on a slightly higher location, and you can see it's making another plateau a little bit higher up. So this is a really good way to add some verticality to your scene, to make some higher ground, where you can also make it flat enough that you could easily like build a town up on this high ground and not have to have everything be so hilly and bumpy every time that it's raised up off of the original height. So that set height tool is really helpful. Now this plain white terrain is not only boring but a little bit hard to look at, so we're going to give it some color. So first go up to Assets and Import Package, and then Environment. Then you'll get a loading bar for just a few seconds, but you'll have to look up at the top left and click on Import, and then you'll see a loading bar for just a few more seconds. And when this is done importing, what we'll have is a collection of things that will make our environment more interesting. This will include trees and some water and other interesting things, but today we're just going to be using the textures, which are going to look like grass or rocks or dirt or a couple different options that we might want. So now we're selecting the Paint Texture tool that's right in the middle of our terrain tools here. And you can see down below it says that there are no terrain textures defined. So we're going to fix that by clicking on this button with the gear on it that says Edit Textures right below there. And then clicking on Add Texture. That's going to pop up a window up in the top left. And from there we're going to click on Select on the top left box. And we are going to go look for a texture that looks like something that we want everywhere. I usually select something that just looks like grass. This one is called Grass Hill Albedo. And you can see now it looks like I have grass everywhere. And this already just makes everything look a little more interesting. It's easier to see what's going on with our terrain in general. So now I'm going to give you a kind of specific challenge. I want you to try to make a volcano. So I'm going to start my volcano by basically just raising up a mountain. So I'm going to take a pretty big brush. I'm also going to crank up the opacity fairly high so that this won't go too slow. I can get this done pretty quick. Once I've got a nice peak of a mountain here, I'm going to go over to my Paint Height tool and I'm going to shift click near the top so that I can kind of flatten this out and get like a nice broad top to my mountain that I'm going to turn into a volcano here. Eventually I'll make this a little less flat, but this is kind of a good way to get started. Now there's really steep climb up the slope here on the side of my mountain. Volcano to be is not incredibly realistic, so I'm going to take my Paint Height tool, I'm going to lower the opacity down a little bit, and I'm going to go kind of paint these edges in a way that makes it look like a little bit rockier and a little bit of a smoother transition from the flat ground into the rough side of the mountain. So if you want yours to look nice, take a little bit of time on that. But now I'm going to go and with my Paint Height tool, I'm going to crank up my opacity and my brush size. And I'm going to start shift clicking in the center at the top of my mountain and start to carve out the volcano. And you can see I use that little widget up at the top right to look at my scene from a precise top view, which made it really easy to kind of drill straight down and not accidentally carve into the side of my mountain too much. And I've got a nice little start of a volcano here. Now this entire thing being completely green isn't the most convincing thing ever. I've never seen a volcano covered in grass at the top, so let's work on that. So like we did once before, we're going to go to our Paint Terrain and we're going to go to Edit Textures and Add Texture. And we're going to go look for some of our more muddy and rocky textures and bring those into our scene and start painting with those. So you have to make sure that you, after importing it into the scene, actually select it down here. And then I'm going to take a nice big brush and just start painting at least a whole lot of the top and inside of this volcano so that it looks kind of muddy or rocky and not like it's got fresh green grass growing all over it. Gonna make sure I get all the way down inside. And in just a second here, I'm gonna go grab another texture that's kind of a hybrid. It's like a mix between being rocky and grassy. And between that texture and tweaking our opacity a little bit, instead of having a really harsh line where the grass stops and the rock starts, we can kind of fade these together and make this look more believable and realistic. So one more time, here's that process. Edit texture, add texture, click on that top left square where it says select, and I'm going to go look for this other version of the Grass Hill Albedo that's a little bit of a rocky, grassy blend. And again, you can play with your opacity here. It will really help you blend these together. And I'm just going to kind of fade this very rocky and very grassy area together. And this should look pretty convincing. Before you know it, you'll have your own first-person controller in the game, and you can actually kind of walk around and see what this looks like. But for today, just focus on practicing with these tools and experimenting, and make the best darn volcano that you can while you're at it. And before I let you go, don't forget to save your work today and also take a screenshot of it and share it with all of us in the comments so that we can check out each other's progress.